Oh, I forgot to get rid of that. Goodbye thing. Hello, everyone. We live? Is audio? Yes, audio is working this time. Yay! Hello, Handsome Ratch, Lobsel, Jessica, Julie. Freaking... Still trying to fix that. Apparently, it's a problem on the developer's end, but, I'm still trying to see if I can fix it. Odd Molly, Leon, hello, everyone. Welcome to the stream. Today, well, for one, I'm starting to change up the streaming schedule a little bit, mostly because, one, I've been trapped in my house for 6 months and I'm bored out of my mind, and two, I want to try and shift the focus of the channel a little to broaden it so that we can appeal to more folks, get more people to join us. One of us. One up. No cults here, promise. So every 2 p.m. every day at 2 p.m. except for Saturday, we'll have some kind of discussion like this, like we did yesterday. Either a reading, like tomorrow will be Fanfic Friday, or a discussion on something that I have researched or am researching. This is one of the am researching, something I'm not as knowledgeable in as I am, say, occult things. This will be about Japanese poetry. My resources are going to be... Oh, I left the other one. The Floating World in Japanese Fiction, The Essential Haiku, and I have another book called Japanese Literature, and I don't remember who wrote it. Sakai... I'll look at it in a minute. And we're gonna give a little brief overview of where it came from and what it is today and why it's so hard to translate into any other language, because Japanese poetry is gorgeous, but there's so much of it that's so unique to the language itself and to the culture that outside of that context, it's really hard to get what you're meant to get out of it. But before we talk about that, we have to jump back to where it came from, which is ye olden days of the 8th and 9th century. Japan is a culture that came from a bunch of invasions. The original people of Japan are called the Ainu. I don't know if I'm saying that right. A-I-N-U. They were attacked and invaded by Mongols from China and by Malay seafarers from the Philippines. And over time, those groups kind of merged, took over one another, and around the 700s, one family group finally conquered everybody. There was a lot of different warring clans, different families that had power and were trying to take over. One clan, the Yamato, they win. At this point, they are really kind of a very small agrarian economy. Rice farmers, they don't really have big cities. They really don't have big cities at this point in the 700s. But they've started to talk to China quite a lot. And China is in like a golden age, beautiful, giant cities, great and powerful country and government, and it's amazing. And Japan kind of looks at that and goes, holy shit, we're so far behind. And they immediately, at incredible speed, start to jump onto the train with going towards civilization. Let my cat in, because he's mad at me. You want it out, kitty. Come on, kitty. Oh, you come steal my seat? Okay, now Bob, give lecture. Give lecture, Bob. What will you discuss? What are you going to discuss, Bob? Tell me. Give you lecture? No? Okay, I'll give the lecture. So they very, very quickly start to steal everything they can from the Chinese and turn it into their own thing. It's not like they just like copy pasted. They adapted everything to suit their own needs. And it's really fascinating how quickly and how well they changed all this stuff to fit them. I mean, they took a language that isn't from, like, it's not alphabetical. You can't just take the letters and spell out new words. The Chinese symbols specifically reference, specific concepts and things, And the Japanese took that language and transformed it and created a system of references where you could very quickly figure out what it was meant to mean in Japanese. And over time, of course, eventually Japanese as a whole took on a writing system based on Chinese. And that's how we get to them writing things down. Before that, they really didn't. They were an oral culture. And it was only when they decided they wanted to be as cool as the Chinese that they realized they needed a written language and they needed to start writing things down. The first poetry collection to come from all this is called the Manyosho. Let me grab my Manyosho page. It's also, the translation would be, the collection of 10,000 leaves. But like I said, there's so much lost in translation. Leaves is a play on words, where it can, the character can mean age or generation. So it refers to leaves as in pages, as in this is a book of 10,000 poems, but also it is a book of poems for 10,000 generations, 10,000 people. They have a lot of that kind of play on words in their language and their poetry. So they've made a government based on China. They have made cities based on China. They built up their first kind of city at Nara. Yamato built his big castle, and they've kind of made their own baby civilization. And so we need a book of poetry, and that's the Manyosho. It's really unique in that because they're building all this stuff from scratch, they don't have any conventions yet. They don't have any rules. They don't have any, yeah, that's a fair point, Handsome Ratch. That's the government of Japan throughout all of this is going to be a problem because they're going to say what you can do and what you can, anyway. Getting to that, there's not a lot of political critique in their literature and stuff because most of the people writing it would have been very closely looked at by the government, but we'll get to that point. The Manyosho is written by a huge spread of people. It has things in it that were written by peasants, by monks, by scholars, by priests, and the emperor's family. Like, the entire culture participated in this work. And because it really wasn't following any kind of conventions and any rules, because everybody and their brother was writing in it, it is really experimental and very broad look at culture in that time period, which is just really cool. Because usually they don't, this kind of spread is not very common, especially in, like, say, later on, a couple hundred years later, only the aristocrats will be writing this kind of stuff down. So they had two kinds of poems, the choka, which is long, and the tanka, which is short. After the Manyosho, the long one goes away. All of Japanese poetry is a history of things getting shorter and more condensed and more focused into a point of very specific, very beautiful moments with a lot of very vivid detail that really, it kind of like a focal lens on a small scene. That's what's going to be what we're working towards. But the Manyosho hadn't quite gotten there yet. It had a bunch of long forms as well as the shorter forms. The thing that has to be understood about Japanese poetry is the language itself doesn't lend itself to poetry in the sense that Western does. Western poetry relies a lot on meter, on the cadence of words and the stress of words. It relies on rhyming. But in Japanese, most of your syllables are short and end in vowels. So every word, you could accidentally rhyme half your poem. Rhyming really doesn't have any importance in Japanese poetry because it's just not going to work. It's going to be ridiculous. Meter also is non-existent because all of their syllables are given the same stress. There isn't any sense of meter things. Will we look at Japanese writer in literature? Yeah! Oh, the floating world! Yukio Zoshi! I almost made today about the floating world, but then I decided we'd just do poetry in general. Where the haiku name derives from. We will come to where it derives from. We're building to haiku. So, you don't have meter, you don't have rhyme. What they do have is syllables. And so, for Japanese poetry, the focus became the repetition, the syllable count which creates a kind of rhythm in your poem, which is why, the thing that we were taught in high school in the United States was the Japanese have a poem called the haiku, it's 575. That's all we knew, is the syllable count is 575. The reason for the focus on syllable count is because that's like the main way of creating a kind of a rhythm and a cadence in the poem that works for Japanese. The other aspect of poetry in Japanese that really works, that creates the sort of poetic feeling, is a lot of very specific visual imagery that over the centuries became so entrenched in poetry. It has like a gut instinctual response for the Japanese. Like things that the poets over time just kept referencing, kept discussing. Now everybody knows that this means this kind of emotion, this means this kind of feeling, and would eventually build to the kind of references later poets would make back to older poems over time. So like the moon is all everywhere in poetry in Japan. You do not find poems about the sun, but you find poems about the moon. And over the centuries, the same kinds of things would be said about the moon, so that when a poem references the moon, immediately a Japanese person is going to go, oh, well, that means this. Because centuries of poets have always said this about the moon. Hello, Melionel. Thank you. I am feeling much better. I feel like I've seen haiku deviate from the count. Is that a thing? Eventually it will, but mostly what you're probably seeing is that it's hard to translate haiku and stick to the syllable count. In Japanese, it probably had the right count, but in English, it rarely does. Later in, like, the 17th, 18th, later on, there will be people that play more with those rules, but often it's because translations for these are hard. So, this is where poetry started, the Manyosho, the use of the kind of syllables and specific imagery to create poetry. Almost all of them were love poems. Like, there's not a lot of variety in topic in these poems, probably because this poetry was requested by the emperor. The emperor said, we need poetry! We need to be like China and have cool history and poetry and stuff. So if you're writing poetry for the emperor, who has all the power in the world, I feel like you're gonna be very careful about what you write. And so you don't find poems critiquing power or government. You don't find war poems. You don't, like, almost all of them are about love and romance, and sometimes about loves being separated, sometimes, like, just very much focused on the relationship between a man and a woman, between lovers, that kind of thing. Huge focus. Over time, they would start including seasonal references in reference to love, like, the two lovers met beneath the trees of the blah, 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 and that kind of thing would weave in together. And using those kind of references over time led to more and more of seasonal references and nature becoming a part of poetry. It would take like 100 years for it to become its own thing, but that's where the two main focuses of poetry over the first like 100 years of written history in Japan came from. Was they started writing all these love poems, they started referencing love and nature and referring to nature as kind of a background for love, and then eventually nature became its own focus. The second big collection of poems in Japan is called the Kokinshu, the collection of ancient and modern times, 905. I think it's like 150 years after the Manyosho. At this point, they have convention down pat. They have rules for poems. The emperor has been around for a while, and the poetry is now a job skill. Hey, Akatsuki. To keep your job in the aristocracy or in the government, you had to be a good poet. There were competitions where people would write poetry, and this is all the aristocrats. This is the high level, the people in the emperor's court. They would have to write poems and say, hey, here's my cool poem. Everyone would, very, very cool. The winner is the emperor. Yes, the winner is the emperor again. Thank you. We are so glad the emperor has won. He always won. But it became part of your job to be good at poetry because it increased your social standing, and it might influence whether or not you got to stay the head honcho of such and such house. So you get a lot of poetry from this era from aristocrats writing about their love lives in very morose and somber tones. Like, these poems tend to be pretty melancholy. They kind of reference the transience of life. That said, they aren't very religious yet. Buddhism and various things had already come over from the continent, and they had started to permeate Japanese culture, but it would take a long time for them to actually really dig in there. And for the most part, especially in these early years, Japan's poetry and literature had very little to do with their religious thoughts. And so they didn't really write a lot about heaven, about passing on to the next life, whereas like Christian poetry is like, European stuff is endowed with religion. Japanese poetry really wasn't. It was very much this world, your daily life, your feelings, your thoughts, and in another contrast to other cultures, there were a lot of women writing, a lot. It was actually a woman who wrote The Tale of Genji, which is like the most famous novel to come out of Japan. Japan invented novels, but we're not discussing that today. A lot of women wrote because the women at court didn't have any economic or political responsibility. Like, they weren't allowed to advance in the court, but they also didn't have a lot of, like, things to do. They couldn't be exposed to the outside world. Like, they sat around and they wrote because it's what they could do. We also have a lot of diaries from them at that time that tell you about, their very insular world. Part of the reason that Japanese poetry tends to be very, very focused is because a lot of these early poets had a very linear life, like a very closed-in, very closed life. The women that worked at court didn't know anything outside of court. And so these poems were very small, short, specific poems about their feelings, their thoughts, their experiences, usually about love, about nature. At this point, the tanka, which is a 5-line poem, was the general rule. So most of the, or I think all of the Kokinshu poems were the 5-line poems. May not be one-to-one. Several English phrases and words in reference to Shakespeare plays. Yep. The China and Japan had far more years of poets to create far more concise, focused references. Yes. A lot of Japanese and Chinese poetry and literature has a lot of in-references to previous works that go over the head of anyone that hasn't been steeped in that literature. Let's see here. So one of the cool things about the Kokinshu, even though they all are short poems, the person that arranged the Kokinshu arranged them in a way so that they kind of had a longer story to them. Like, the seasonal poems would be arranged spring, summer, fall, winter, as if it was one long poem. But it was actually a lot of short poems written by different people. This trend would become a big thing as poetry expanded and became a kind of communal activity. I think it's called the Renga? Where's my other notes? Poetic form. Where did it go? I think it's called Renga. I'm almost 100%, but probably not 100% thinking that it is called the Renga. Maybe it's on this page. Aha! Here we go. The History of Japanese Literature. Suichi Kaito. That's who wrote that. So, the Renga, which is what I think it's called, I'm gonna find it here, was a practice where people at a group, usually like a party or maybe a traveling group, would get together and they'd write poetry as a team. One person would write the first 3 lines, the next one would write the next 2 lines, and that would be one tanka, one poem. But then a third person would come in and write another 3 lines that created a new poem with the first 2 that came before it. And there would be rules like you'd have to go through the seasons in order, certain things would have to happen, and it was a party game where people would write this poem together, and eventually there would be collections made and published of these big poems. Another really unique thing about Japanese poetry was it often had this communal aspect. I already talked about the aristocracy had those competitions, and then when they published the Kokinshu, it was kind of arranged like different people's poems are the same, part of one big poem. That kind of plays into the Renga, where they had these poetry collabs. The entire schools came up around this concept of teaching you how to write this style of poetry. Let's see here. Okay, so we're gonna skip a little bit because I'm still reading through the section on the like period between two periods. We're gonna jump to the floating world, the era where haiku comes from. Around, let me make sure I have the age. Oh man, 1640. So from the time of the Kokinshu, that like the thousands, they had, what happened in that era is the aristocracy wrote basically everything, created this big history. Eventually that whole situation collapses. The problem with the new Japanese government that they'd created was that it was based on China. And China, their system has a meritocracy where everybody who gets a job in government has to pass all these tests and learn all these things and get the job. Japan had originally been a bunch of warring family clans, and then one clan won and took over. Well, guess what happened? That clan gave all the good jobs to all their members of their clan and all their family members, and inevitably it fell apart, because when you give jobs to people because they're your cousin may not be good at that job. So eventually that version of government starts to kind of fall apart. You get to the warring states era at one point, blah blah blah. Everybody's fighting each other. Eventually, Japan is reconquered by one person, by one, a lot of history, and we get the Tokugawa era, which is like late 1600s to early 1900s, about right there. This is the era where Japan closes its borders and says, fuck you guys, you can't come in here, no. The reason, one, it consolidates their power, keeps foreign governments and stuff from interacting, which you think about how much influence China's had on Japan, they were probably trying to, put some distance between them and China. Two, there were a lot of Christian missionaries at the time who actually muddled around in politics and got involved with some of the warring states. And the Tokugawa government didn't like that, and they said, Christians, get out of here, stop meddling with our politics, go away. And so, oh, bye, Jessica. Have a good day at work. So they locked the country down. They kicked out all the Christians. There was one city where you could get ships from, the Dutch, and that was it. Tokugawa era, actually, as much as that sounds like it would be horrible, and probably was, it was a very oppressive and controlling government, it was a really great time for literature and poetry and art. Japan, when it turned its gaze inward, there was so much creativity in this time period. You get the ukiyo-e paintings, the paintings that are so famous for Japan. If you imagine a Japanese painting, it's probably from this time period. The haiku is kind of invented at this point. A lot of really famous works. It's a plethora of creation at this time. And it's also a time of increasing economic growth. They start to use money instead of trading rice, which the government didn't like that, because the money economy allowed normal townspeople a lot of power and influence. In Japanese culture, you got the government officials, the aristocracy, you got the samurai, you got farmers, and you got townsfolk called chonin. Farmers have food and rice, so they're important. Samurai are important, they got swords. Aristocracy, they have power, they're important. Townsfolk are the bottom of the rung. Nobody's supposed to like them. But by this period, townsfolk, with a money economy and the increasing need for entertainment and for buying and selling, the economy boom just led to the biggest increase in the power and money and influence of the ordinary townsfolk. A huge rise in the chonin, which led to a rise in entertainment industries. This is when you start to see kabuki theater. This is when you start to see the tea houses, which were brothels. All this stuff rises in city life because those folks had built up a lot of money and power, and they wanted to spend it. They didn't do a lot with architecture because The government may not have liked it if you had a big fancy mansion, but there was a lot of fancy furniture, a lot of fancy clothing. Merchants is the word I was looking for. Thank you, Akatsuki. Sometimes my brain farts. There was a lot of furniture and clothing, a lot of artwork and paintings and that kind of thing. A lot of theater, but not as much architecture being made by, like, very, very rich people. There was beautiful architecture, but not like, I'm going to go make myself a mansion kind of thing. This was when the samurai do start to have a downfall. But at the same time, a lot of the samurai class start to adjust and become part of the rising new classes. The chonin having so much money to spend means that now there is a specific arts group, craftsmen now exist, because all these rich people want to go and buy shit. Somebody's got to make the shit. So now for the first time you have a job as an artist or a job as a poet. And a lot of the people that took those jobs were either former samurai or the children of former samurai, which gets us to Matsuo Basho, who is basically credited with inventing the haiku. And he was the son of a low-level samurai. At this point, they were losing a lot of their power, and he basically was just kind of allowed to do what he wanted, and he was allowed to become a poet. His dad kind of just let him off, if I remember right. Yeah, provincial samurai, and he traveled to Edo. Japan's very unique in that its culture tends to be very city-centric, in that one city dominates a literary culture at one time. Edo, Osaka, Kyoto, and of course in the modern day Tokyo. Basically every creative person, every artist lives in the one city. And in Basho's time, that was Edo, so that's where he goes. He was a very talented poet, and wrote in the style that I was talking about, where they have those games where you write back and forth. You write 3 lines, and then 2 lines, and then 3 lines. So the 3 and the 2 lines together, the 5, that's called the tanka, which I was talking about as the short form poem. When you build them all together, it's the renga, the longer form. When you just take out the 3 lines, that was called a hoka. Let me jump back and make sure I'm calling it the right thing. But it was basically a building block for other poems. Hoku, that's what it was called originally. It was a building block for other poems. It was Basho who first had the thought, really, to focus in on this one piece of longer poems and specialize in it. So he took one of the building blocks of the longer kind of game poem and made it his own thing. And writing it over and over and over kind of created his own rules for what you should do with it. That would become 150 years later what we know as the haiku. It was very attentive to a specific time and place. Like I was talking earlier, their poetry and their works really came down into a window for looking at a very small, very specific thing. There was always a seasonal reference called a kigo, typically in the first line or in the third line. And it helped to put the poem into a specific time or place. It could be something as simple as, you could reference a leek. I went to the market to buy leeks, because you can only buy those in a specific time of year. So that immediately places the poem in a specific season. It was very referential, because they had this long history of poems at this point. There was a lot of references that went into the poem, so that when Japanese folks read it, they inevitably know that this poem is supposed to reference a specific thing, or it's meant to create a specific emotion, because it uses this image that this kind of has always been associated with this. Bye, Odd Molly! Like, snowfall had a certain emotion that it always would mean in a poem like this, and so if a Japanese person read that word and saw that image, they have that feeling in them, which when you translate it, that doesn't carry over. The first level, location and nature. Second level was a Buddhist reflection on nature, which is, in the past, early on in the first 200 years of poetry, really reflecting on the world and your place in it, and Buddhism wasn't a big thing yet. It took a long time to get in there, but by this point, it was Buddhist reflection, and religious thought was a big part of Japan, and so it wrapped into what had already become traditional with Japanese poetry, which was focusing very, very small pieces of poems on a small subject related to nature or love or both. And so now you take and you put a Buddhist spin on it and you think about like the transience of life or that kind of thing. He is the one that first did this. He was very, very, very popular in his time. He had a background in Chinese poetry and Taoism, which is one of their religions, which wouldn't be always normal going forward, because as the Tokugawa era goes forward, they start, really not liking anything that's not Japanese. And so for hundreds of years, it was normal to study Chinese language and Chinese poetry and stuff. It stops being normal a little after his time. He centered his poetry on what he calls loneliness or aloneness. And it's very, very somber. It tends to be a little bit bittersweet, I think, is what his poems are like. Now we're going to divert a little bit and talk about something fun. There are theories that he was possibly, in some way, shape, or form, queer. We know he had female relationships, but he also references possible male relationships and explicitly stated at one point he was fascinated with the ways of homosexual love. At this point in Japanese history, it is not abnormal at all to write about homosexual or same-sex love. One of his contemporaries literally published a book on gay samurais, Saikaku Ihara Saikaku, I think it is. I can't remember, because the old textbooks I read always switch it the other way around rather than keep it the way it's supposed to be in Japanese, so I keep getting confused. But, so there were theories that he was actually possibly had relations with men as well as women. And when we get to the part where I'm going to read some of his diaries, I will read a portion that comes across to me as incredibly gay. So he was fascinating. He spent most of his life kind of penniless, not in the sense that he didn't, like, his works were popular and all, but he traveled the country as, like, a wandering monk, so he really lived poorly. He spent like 10 years on the road, which was that's another big tradition in Japanese literature, is the travel diary, travel journal, where he'd write about where he went, and he'd write some poems on his, way, and then, that kind of thing, sort of a spiritual and literary journey. So after him, like, I think 50 years later, let's see, 1716, so a couple decades after him comes the next guy, Yosa Busen, which at this point, literature and art in Japan has really transitioned into what's called the floating world, or ukiyo, which, again, you've probably heard of ukiyo-y artwork. It's very pleasure focused. It's very the moment, now. All of the literature and the artwork that was done in this era was incredibly focused on feeling good. I mean, to the point that half this stuff was basically pornographic. Very burlesque, very sexual. There's a lot of pornographic artwork and woodcuts that came out at this time. The most famous novelist of the time, Ihara Sakaku, basically wrote low what would you call it? Like, not exactly explicit sex and stuff, but basically kind of romance novels. A lot of his characters in his books were literally just kind of soap opera-y, where nobody's a good character, everybody's kind of doing terrible things and screwing with everybody and screwing everybody, and it ends with the character kind of, typically it's framed as if the person in their old age is telling you the story and saying, things were pretty raunchy back then, huh? I'm now old and I am different now, and those were bad times. I did bad things, but you want to talk about those bad things? They were entertaining. There was this kind of level of irony where they sort of give it a weak moral framing, where they're like, oh yeah, look at this terrible thing this person did. Look at it. Look at it. But, even though they're giving it that framework, there's this kind of wink involved where everybody knows that really you're there for the bad stuff, for these people behaving badly and being mischievous. This kind of theme permeated artwork and the theater. I mean, kabuki theater was originally a form of prostitution where women would dress up very pretty and have music and singing on the side of the road to try and entice customers, and then eventually they got to go on stage, and eventually women were banned from the theater because the brothels didn't like the women, getting out of the brothels. This was a huge point of power for the theater and the brothel. These were the center of Japanese culture at this time, where almost all of the novels and fiction of the time were set in those locations with the kind of people you'd meet there, the sex workers, the theater actors, famous people, very soap opera-y in their works. Yosa Busen was a ukiyo-e painter and also a poet. He worked in the haiku form, and the art and the painting were really tied together very heavily by calligraphy. For Japan and China as well, there wasn't as much of a division between painting and artwork and writing, because they were kind of done together or tied in together. At this time, a lot of the illustrators were working with authors and writers and were illustrating specific scenes and things to go with the books and be published together as picture books. He also studied Chinese works, even though at the time it was no longer considered a good thing. It was kind of looked down upon. But he was a very creative figure. Didn't really experiment or change much in the way of what his former Matsuo Basho did. But he did do some interesting things. There was a lot of this was a rise in the power of the artist, where they were starting to write to make money, and he was not a fan of that. I think one of his poems was, let's see if I put it down here. No, maybe it was the next guy who wrote that. One of the poets in here wrote a poem that basically was, "It is not art to write about snow for rich people," or something to that effect. There was a lot of that as this art started to get so popular and make so much money. That kind of conversation started, where, what is art? Can you make art and be paid for it? That kind of thing. He was also an actor. He actually acted on stage and illustrated some of Basho's works, which came before him. And after him, we have what's called the third master of the haiku form, which at this is when we start hearing it called haiku, rather than just being the hoku that they took from the longer form. Now you see the haiku being its own thing, really standing on its own and being really a big thing, so famous, so popular, more so than the other forms. So now we're in the late 18th century with Kobayashi Issa, who's personally my favorite. He was far more experimental than his predecessors and kind of did his own thing. He really liked writing about speaking to little creatures and animals and bugs and things. One of his poems was like, "Excuse me, cricket, I'm about to roll over." Talking about he's, in bed and there's a cricket in his bed and he's trying to get comfortable and he wants it to get out of the way. There's another one that says something like, "I am a Buddhist, and yet I still kill mosquitoes." Talking about the fact that in Buddhism you're not supposed to kill anything, and kind of the irony there of the fact that he is Buddhist, but he's still, going around killing these little bugs. His poems are really fun. He did what was kind of called countrified poems, because unlike his two predecessors, who were kind of middle or upperish class, he was born in middle of nowhere to a small town farmer and really was far more lower class than the other two. He wrote with dialects and with country style themes. He was unfortunately he suffered a lot in his life. He lost something like 3 children and a wife. His father died, and his stepfamily was really horrible to him. They took his inheritance from him and fought him, and he had to go to court for it. Like, the guy went through so much stuff, and he writes about a lot of it in his poems. Like, he writes about his dead daughter. He writes about thinking about the last time he sees the sunset with his dad. Like, his poems really hit me in a different way than the others did. And to a certain extent, I think their themes translate easier because they don't focus as much on the referential kind of to past poems. They don't focus as much on the wordplay, the things that are lost when you leave the Japanese language. He didn't really focus on writing those as much, so his poems translate a lot better. One of his is, what a strange thing to be alive beneath cherry blossoms. It's really, really lovely. I really like his work. Let's see here what else we've got. Zealous Flea, you're about to be a Buddha by my hand. There's a lot of humor in his works, far more than previous. Like, he is a lot more irreverent and, you know, writes about Buddha and religion in a really lighthearted kind of way. And yet he also is really deep and somber with, you know, the things he's been through and the things he's suffered. What good luck. Bitten by this year's mosquitoes, too. Napped half the day. No one punished me. Like, his works are just so much fun. I really enjoy his works. Oh, he also had the commentary about writing for the rich. Writing shit about new snow for the rich is not art. What a creative character. So he and his two previous, the two folks I mentioned previously, Busan and Basho, those three are considered the three masters of haiku. They're the ones who really defined what it was, kind of figured out its conventions, set it up as a form of writing, and made it popular. And now today, haiku is really at least, you know, in my experience in the United States, when people think of Japanese poetry, they think of haiku. There's a lot more to it. There's 1,000 years of written poetical history, and the haiku doesn't even really come up until, you know, Basho in the late 17th century. So there's 700, 800 years of history, but what really stands out is the haiku, because there's just something so incredibly powerful about that small, focused image of something beautiful and transient. And each of these artists really did do it very differently, but I really personally think Kobayashi Issa, Issa, if you're going to look up any of them, you should definitely enjoy his works. Members this week, I actually took and read aloud all of Kobayashi Issa's poems from this collection for the members video. So if you're a member, you get to see that. For you guys, I'm going to actually read an excerpt of Matsuyo Basho's fiction. All three of these guys wrote various things other than poems. They wrote travel journals, you know, that kind of thing. What is haiku? Haiku, Haiku, is a Japanese poetic form. So we're going to read The Hut of the Phantom Dwelling, because I thought it was really lovely. It has some lovely thoughts in it. This is written when Matsuyo Basho, like I said, spent most of his life traveling, 10 years on the road, often very, you know, penniless. And this is written about when he'd come back from another journey to stay at a hut that his students had prepared for him, and his thoughts upon returning to live in this little house. Beyond Ishiyama, with its back to Mount Iwama, is a hill called Kokubuyama. The name, I think, derives from a government temple of long ago. If you cross the narrow stream that runs at the foot and climb the slope for 3 turnings of the road, some 200 paces each, you come to a shrine of the god Hachiman. The object of worship is a statue of the Buddha Amida. This is the sort of thing that is greatly abhorred by the Yu-Itsu school. Though I regard it as admirable that, as the Ryobu assert, the Buddhas should dim their light and mingle with the dust in order to benefit the world. Ordinarily, few worshippers visit the shrine, and it's very solemn and still. Beside it is an abandoned hut with a rush door. Brambles and bamboo grass overgrow the eaves. The roof leaks. The plaster has fallen from the walls, and foxes and badgers make their den there. It is called the Genjuan, or the Hut of the Phantom Dwelling. The owner was a monk, an uncle of the warrior Suganumu Kyokushi. It has been 8 years since he lived there. Nothing remains of him now but his name, Elder of the Phantom Dwelling. I, too, gave up city life some 10 years ago, and now I'm approaching 50. I'm like a bagworm that's lost its bag, a snail without its shell. I've tanned my face in the hot sun of Kisakata at Oi, and brushed my heels on the rough beaches of the northern sea, where tall dunes make walking so hard. And now this year, here I am, drifting by the waves of Lake Biwa. The grebe attaches its floating nest to a single strand of reed to keep it from washing away in the current. With a similar thought, I mended the thatch on the eaves of the hut, patched up the gaps in the fence, and at the beginning of the 4th month, the first month of summer, moved in for what I thought would be no more than a brief stay. Now, though, I'm beginning to wonder if I'll ever want to leave. Spring is over, but I can tell it hasn't gone for long. Azaleas continue to bloom, wild wisteria hangs from the pine trees, and a cuckoo now and then passes by. I even have greetings from the jays and woodpeckers that peck at things, but I really don't mind. In fact, I rather enjoy them. I feel as though my spirit had raced off to China to view the scenery in Wu or Chu, as though I were standing beside the lovely Hisao and Hisang rivers or Lake Tongting. The mountain rises behind me to the southwest, and the nearest houses are a good distance away. Fragrant southern breezes blow down from the mountaintops, and north winds, dampened by the lake, are cool. I have Mount Hiei and the tall peak of Hira, and this side of them the pines of Karasaki veiled in mist, as well as a castle, a bridge, and boats floating on the lake. I hear the voice of the woodsman making his way to Kasatori, and the songs of seedling planters in the little rice paddies at the foot of the hill. Fireflies weave through the air in the dusk of evening. Clapper rails tap out their notes. There's surely no lack of beautiful scenes. Among them is Mikamiyama, which is shaped rather like Mount Fuji and reminds me of my old house in Musashino, while Mount Tanakami sets me to counting all the poets of ancient times who are associated with it. Other mountains include Bamboo Grass Crest, 1,000-Yard Summit, and Skirt Waist. There's Blackford Village, where the foliage is so dense and dark and the men tend their fish weirs, looking exactly as they're described in the Manyoshu. In order to get a better view all around, I've climbed up the height of my hut, rigged a platform among the pines, and furnished it with a round straw mat. I call it Monkey's Perch. I'm not in a class with those Chinese eccentrics I'm not going to say this right, Husu Chuan, who made himself a nest in a cherry apple tree where he could do his drinking, or Old Man Wong, who built his retreat on Secretary Peak. I'm just a mountain dweller, sleepy by nature, who has returned his footsteps to the steep slopes and sits here in the empty hills, catching lice and smashing them. Sometimes, when I'm in an energetic mood, I draw clear water from the valley and cook myself a meal. I have only the drip, drip of the spring to relieve my loneliness, but with my one little stove, things are anything but cluttered. The man who lived here before was truly lofty in mind and did not bother with any elaborate construction. Besides the one room where the Buddha image is kept, there's only a little place designed to store bedding. An eminent monk of Mount Kora in Tsukyushi, the son of a certain Kai of the Kamo Shrine, recently journeyed to Kyoto, and I got someone to ask him if he would write a plaque for me. He readily agreed, dipped his brush, and wrote the 3 characters Gen-ju on. He sent me the plaque, and I keep it as a memorial of my grass hut. Mountain home, traveler's rest. Call it what you will, it's hardly the kind of place where you need any great store of belongings. A cypress bark hat from Kiso, a sedge rain cap from Koshi. That's all that hangs on the post above my pillow. In the daytime, I'm once in a while diverted by people who stop to visit. The old man who takes care of the shrine or the men from the village come and tell me about the wild boar who's eating the rice plants, the rabbits that are getting at the bean patches, tales of farm matters that are all quite new to me. And when the sun has begun to sink behind the rim of the hills, I sit quietly in the evening waiting for the moon so I may have a shadow for company, or light a lamp and discuss right and wrong with my silhouette. But when all has been said, I am not really the kind who is so completely enamored of solitude that he must hide every trace of himself away in the mountains and wilds. It's just that, troubled by frequent illness and weary with dealing with people, I've come to dislike society. Again and again, I think of the mistakes I've made in my clumsiness over the course of the years. There was a time when I envied those who had government offices or impressive domains, and on other occasion I considered entering the precincts of the Buddha and the teaching room of the patriarchs. Instead, I've worn out my body in journeys that are as aimless as the winds and clouds, and expended my feelings on flowers and birds. But somehow I've been able to make a living this way. And so in the end, unskilled and talentless as I am, I give myself wholly to this one concern, poetry. Po Chu-yi worked so hard at it that he almost ruined his 5 vital organs, and Tufu grew lean and emaciated because of it. As far as intelligence or the quality of our writings go, I can never compare to such men. And yet, we all in the end live, do we not, in a phantom dwelling? But enough of that. I'm off to bed. I find that so lovely. What a lovely little, just short, condensed image of the poet in the mountains. And he's so self-aware, too. You know, he knows that he's writing of what the image of what people think a poet is, but at the same time, he doesn't think he's that image. He compares himself to other very famous Chinese poets at the time and says, but I'm not like them. You know, he says, I'm not really looking to stay away from everyone in the mountains and the wilderness, but I don't like society. And I love the line about looking to the moon for a shadow's companion, speaking right and wrong with his shadow, like, it's a very lovely little image of a man looking back on his life and what he's come to and thinking about how, you know, what he's really gotten out of it. The fact that everything is a phantom dwelling. He doesn't really have belongings, he doesn't own things, he doesn't really have a traditional family, and yet he has found some measure of success in the world that he's dedicated himself to, and he really can't find it in himself to regret it. And then the very end of it is just so ordinary, which reinforces the idea that what he has that's valuable is his everyday life. Oh, that's enough. Off to bed. Very lovely. I really like his work. His poems are also pretty lovely. I still think Issa is the best translated into English. Some authors, like this guy, goes through in the back and explains some of the wordplay and such. Not all of it. Oh, I did say I was going to read the bits that made Basho, the guy that we just read. He is the one that folks traditionally thought might be gay or have homosexual relations. There's 2 things. He wrote a poem that references a Japanese concept. Where did it go now? He talks about gay men. He uses a word that specifically means gay men. He also has a section here. He has it called the Saga Diaries, which is his daily diary. Less poetic than that piece I just read. Some of it is more just, this is what I did that day, and this is whatever. But there's a really sad part here where he writes about someone that died in his life who was a student of his, a few years younger than him, I think. I'm not sure. But he writes about him in such a sad way. He showed me deep regard. We shared our pleasure, sometimes our sorrows. I have never for a moment forgotten him. Because of all this, I have dreamed of him. After waking up, I weep again. That's pretty gay. Anyway, I find him fascinating. Basho is great. But yeah, that is a very, very brief look at Japanese poetry. We may do more of this in the future. I'm still reading up on various texts, but these discussions will vary. More likely they'll be focused more on the occult and mythology. Sometimes I want to try and do some actual fiction discussions with books and Lord of the Rings and such. But that is what we're doing today. Afterwards, I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing. I will go to the Discord and figure it out and all that jazz, but thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you to all these members that have been here today. Handsome Ratch, Phil, Daniel, I think Jeff might have been here for a second, Pablo, I wanted to make sure I get everybody. Odd Molly was here earlier. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Silent Leon, Jessica, you're amazing. Thank you all so much. If you want to support the channel and you like what I do, you can do so with the links in the description. For as little as 99 cents a month, you get a lot of bonus content. I read poetry, I read the research that I'm doing. I do extra videos and things. If you can afford it and you like what I do, consider doing that. You can also check out my social media to keep up to date with what I'm doing, join the Discord to hang out and play games and do cool stuff. Yeah, I think that's everything. I don't know that I was gonna stream a game today, but now my voice is gone because I recorded Silent Hill Symbolism today, so hopefully that will be up within the next 2 weeks. But now my voice is gone. So I don't know, maybe we'll watch TV or something, but we'll figure that out later. So thanks again, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.